Hello, very beautiful community. The new US national security strategy is out, and it is a bit Orwellian. It's very anti European, it's pro Russian, and it's a tiny bit fascisized. And this is a version of normal. So we have to both accept what's shocking, but also understand that it doesn't mean that the ground beneath us is parting ways and we're all going to fall through to a place that is infernal and calamitous. So it's important to sort of keep two things in mind. We're on a particularly challenging trajectory. We're coming out of the bay, going into open water. It doesn't mean, on the other hand, that we are going to sink. So let's read a little bit and get some takeaways. So, American diplomacy should continue, and the underlinings are mine, to stand up for genuine democracy, freedom of expression, and unapologetic celebrations of European nations' individual character and history. America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote the revival of spirit and the growing influence of patriotic European parties, you know which parties these are, indeed gives cause for great optimism. There is the stark prospect of European civilizational erasure. The larger issues facing Europe include the activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty. The promotion of the revival of spirit is a fascisized line, I'm afraid. It's a reference to action that is virile and unconstrained. Now, I'm not going to say that this is a fascist document. It isn't a fascist document, but this is a fascisized line, and it's not an accident that you find a fascisized line in a document like this. The core thing that we have to understand here is that there may well be legitimate concerns, legitimate problems, legitimate grievances, but here we're being sold snake oil. And the snake oil is basically this. It's to point at European technocratic centrism and say that is not working. It's a problem. And it's especially been a problem when it's recently taken a woke twist. And it's a democratic problem, right? Well, how is it a democratic problem? Well, the democratic problem is that when technocratic centrism tries to resolve conflicts in society, in very polarized societies, it excludes one or often both of the parties in conflict by outsourcing a decision to either some kind of domain of expertise or to an account of what the parties in conflict in the population would say if they were more rational than they are. And this politics is extremely effective and democratically legitimate in fairly homogenized, unified societies with a good degree of consensus about their values. But when you live in very polarized societies, technocratic governance is inherently de-democratizing, right? Because it says we're not going to listen to people's sentiments on the doorsteps. We're going to outsource decisions about what happens to some set of rationally superior procedures, right? So there is indeed an inherent democratic deficit in the government of somebody like Keir Starmer in the UK. So all of that is true, but how is electing Nigel Farage and the AfD and authoritarian, populist, anti-democratic political forces in Europe help? It's a bit like if your house is spectacularly dysfunctional because your furniture is ugly, it's the wrong kind of furniture, it's extremely unclean, you haven't hoovered for 5 years. And I say, look, I've got a great solution. Let's demolish your house. Well, demolishing your house does not help you take care of the problem with your furniture, of the problem of the dysfunctionality in your house, of the problem with the dust. You've got to keep two things in mind here, right? Yes, there's democratic deficit. You don't need to be a resistance liberal who thinks that there's nothing wrong with Hillary Clinton type politics except that they're irrational voters. You've got to understand that there is a problem, but the solution is not to break the democratic game, because when you try to break the democratic game, you become much less democratic than the technocratic officials you're criticizing, because for all of their detachment from the core elements of civic consent in society, they don't want to break institutions, and you do. So the snake oil here is that authoritarianism is being sold to Europe under a banner of democratic freedom. So these irresponsible, entrepreneurial, often post-truth little shits in the Trump administration are saying that to increase democracy, you got to do away with democracy. And they can go F off. Got to draw a very, very clear line in admitting the challenges with our politics, which are significant, but recognizing that these are snake oil solutions that are taking busy and stressed voters for a ride, often because these irresponsible post-truth characters need to advance their careers, right? So again, this is difficult because we're keeping two things in mind. We don't want to say there's nothing wrong, but we don't want to move from admitting that there's a lot wrong to the idea that you need to break the democratic game to fix it, because breaking the democratic game is demolishing the house you need to repair. Over the long term, it's more plausible that within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. As such, it's an open question whether they will view their place in the world or their alliance with the United States in the same way as those who signed the NATO Charter. So, I mean, this is an anticipation of the white nationalism that's to come in the West, I'm afraid. And it's very important here again to keep two things in mind. A lot of citizens are very concerned about the porousness of their borders, and against the background of a process of globalization began in the 80s and 90s, people feel that they don't control their country anymore, and that's a very real sentiment, and people are genuinely out of sync with the technocratic centrist policies on immigration. We have to admit that. But white nationalist identity politics doesn't follow from that. What follows from that is that you need to have control over illegal immigration, and you need to have robust public discourse about how much legal immigration the country needs and can take. Two things in mind, again, right? So we've got this kind of exclusionary identity politics here that is taking advantage of the legitimate grievances of voters. You admit the legitimate grievances of voters, you deny the white nationalist politics. This is something I'll put on the screen a couple of times because I want to pick out a few details here. Our broad policy for Europe should prioritize, let's jump to the underlined bit, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. Let's move to what I think is a second very significant implication. And that's that Europe is a bigger obstacle than Russia to peace in Europe, in Ukraine. Let's quote. A large European majority wants peace, yet that desire is not translated into policy, in large measure because of those governments' subversion of democratic processes. This is strategically important to the United States precisely because European states cannot reform themselves if they're trapped in political crisis. So there are two claims here. Europe suppresses democracy in the name of a mobilization for a conflict with Russia. And Europe needs to stop doing that and needs to agree to a peace deal in Ukraine, of whatever kind we can get now, so that it can restore its democracy. Again, what we've got is an exclusionary, irresponsible, authoritarian rendition of a real problem. Europe genuinely has a very difficult tension. The more it spends on the military to shore up its security against global threats and the Russian threat in particular, the less it's going to have to spend on the kind of programs of a welfare sort that restore trust, or at least diminish the diminution of trust. And it's very, very difficult. And it's a lose-lose predicament, because the more we invest in defense, the more trust we're going to lose. But we need to invest in defense to react to the Russian threat. But at the same time, the more we do that in response to the Russian threat, the more we will undermine our democracies at the level of citizen trusted institutions, which will then lead to more pro-Russian authoritarian populists coming to power. Very, very difficult. We don't do defense, we're vulnerable to the Russians. We do defense, we're vulnerable to Russian fancying authoritarian populists at home. It's difficult. This is the difficulty of politics. But the irresponsible shits in the White House, in the Trump administration, want to simplify complex dilemmas. So what they really want to say is, it's easy. You just prioritize democracy and you stop worrying about the Russian threat beyond a certain extent. And prioritizing democracy actually isn't for them engaging in the sorts of programs that bring about economic democratization, restore people's trust. It's actually just vote for post-truth irresponsible authoritarians like Farage. Now, the next point I want to make is there is an Orwellian element here, namely that the document gives the impression that the main threat to democracy in the world is not Russia or China, but Europe. And it then goes on to claim that the solution to democratic insufficiency in Europe is a set of policies that I would judge to be anti-democratically authoritarian, right? Europe's the biggest threat to democracy in the world, and the way you fix the threat that Europe poses to democracy is by turning Europe authoritarian. Russia is not mentioned much, except in relation to Europe's allegedly excessive concerns about the Russian threat, and in relation to actually a positive aspirational statement about US and Russian relations. So, let's read. Our broad policy for Europe should prioritize reestablishing conditions of stability within Europe and strategic stability with Russia. Ukraine now. Let's put this back up. The Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. A large European majority wants peace, yet that desire is not translated into policy. So the point here is Ukraine is losing the war, and Ukraine is only continuing to fight because Europe is blocking peace, and Europe is blocking peace because it doesn't like democracy. Now, the single biggest takeaway from this is that this is a presentation of imperial decline, reduction in US state capacity, and global retreat. The Trump administration is degrading state capacity across the board in a way that will not be reversible for Democrats in the future. It's undermining relations of trust with allies, and it's also dramatizing, exacerbating the social factors that have led to the crisis of trust that have got these folks into power in the first place. So what's very important in this reaction is that the historical picture is not Trump bad, let's have him leave power as soon as possible, Democrats good, they're back, it's going to be fine. They're going to be back and then it's going to be fine. The takeaway is whoever is in power in the United States, we are witnessing a reduction of US capacity to act on the global stage with efficacy and constructiveness. Now, this is us 100, 200 meters out of the bay heading into open water. We're nowhere near sinking. European democracies are nowhere near sinking. US democracy is nowhere near sinking, even though it's on course to a coin toss decision about historical decision about whether it sinks or not in the 2030s. That's where we are. So we've done a few dualities in this chat, but the final duality is this is bad, but this is not catastrophic. This is bad, but this is not catastrophic. Societies and indeed democracies have historically persisted through crisis, including crisis that put the survival of democracy on the line. There are some difficult conditions that we face, namely that what happened in the middle of the 20th century was a more catastrophic erosion of democracy than what we're facing now, but a more reversible one. So what we are looking at is a much less disastrous authoritarianism than what we got in the 20th century, but one, because of the social forces out there causing a crisis of trust, one that is much less reversible. So our capacity to change this is limited, but it's real. This is bad and it's going to get worse, but this is not a catastrophe. We're in an age where you're going to need to learn to balance simultaneously, difficult and conflictive truths, if you're going to keep a sense of reality. I know that for some people this is so difficult and so negative that you just want to turn away from politics and kind of regard politics with a kind of a psychology of moral disgust. It's all so bad, I don't want to look at it. That doesn't make you an effective citizen. It does in fact encourage this sort of irresponsible stuff to win. And of course, one of the biggest dualities you've got to keep in mind is that yes, a lot of the problems that these people are pointing to are real, even though they don't analyze these problems correctly, and their solutions are sort of self-refuting and counterproductive, burning down or smashing down your house just because it's internally dysfunctional and needs new furniture, needs a clean, maybe needs a realignment of a few borders between rooms and so on. Lots of love. Keep hanging in there and talk soon.